6 months after my wife passed away, I hired a plumber to fix a fake leak in her old office, just to keep my greedy son from destroying the room. I had just pulled up to the church when my phone rang. It was the plumber. His voice was shaking as he told me I needed to come home right now because he had found something my wife had been hiding inside the walls. Then he dropped his voice to a frantic whisper and warned me to come alone. When I got there, I froze at what I saw. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect the legacy of someone you love from the very people who should respect it most. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the hallway of the house I had called home for 40 years. It was a brutal tearing sound, like someone ripping the pages out of a family history book. I stood at the bottom of the oak staircase watching my son Bradley and his wife Monica pull down the imported silk wallpaper my late wife Cynthia had painstakingly chosen a decade ago. They had moved in 3 months ago, supposedly, to take care of me after Cynthia passed away from aggressive pancreatic cancer. But within weeks, their caretaking felt a lot more like a hostile residential takeover. I am Wallace Montgomery, 67 years old, and apparently a ghost in my own home. I watched as Monica tossed a heavy cardboard box toward a black plastic trash bag. The box tipped over, spilling its contents onto the hardwood floor. They were vintage vinyl records. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped forward, quickly snatching a pristine Jazz, pressing off the floor before her designer sneaker could crush it. I held the record to my chest and told her sharply that Cynthia bought these albums with her very first paycheck as a junior architect back in the 1980s. Cynthia was the breadwinner of our family for a long time, building her architectural firm from absolutely nothing while I managed the household and my own modest career as a high school history teacher. She cherished these records as proof of her first real independent triumph. Monica just rolled her eyes and sighed loudly, muttering something about hoarding useless, dusty junk. That was when Bradley descended the stairs, wiping drywall dust on his expensive jeans. He looked at me with that patronizing smirk he had perfected over the years. He told me in a voice you would use for a confused toddler that my memory was slipping and that I needed to learn how to let go of the past. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a physical restraint than a loving embrace. Then he dropped the real bomb. He announced casually that tomorrow morning his private contractors were coming to gut Cynthia's locked home office at the end of the hall. He said he needed the space for a Peloton and a home gym because the local health club was getting too crowded for his liking. He looked around the hallway and said it was his house now anyway, and it was time to modernize the depressing atmosphere. Panic flared hot in my chest. Cynthia's office had been locked since the day she died. She had made me promise to leave it untouched until I was ready to sort through her drafting tables and endless building blueprints. The thought of Bradley's crude contractors tearing into her sacred space with sledgehammers made me physically sick. I knew I had to buy time. I had to stop the demolition before it started. I forced my breathing to steady and looked Bradley directly in the eye. I lied. I told him he could not tear down the drywall in the office tomorrow because I had noticed a severe water stain spreading behind the baseboards earlier that week. I told him the internal pipes were leaking, and I had already scheduled an emergency plumber to come out this morning to tear open the wall and assess the water damage. Bradley's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a look of deep irritation. He scoffed loudly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He immediately launched into a lecture, calling me financially incompetent. He demanded to know why I was wasting money on expensive emergency weekend rates when he could have just had his cheap contractors patch it up during the demolition process. He reminded me yet again that I was living on a fixed pension and that if it were not for him stepping in to manage the estate, I would probably be totally bankrupt by now. The irony tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. He was the one driving imported sports cars while living rent-free in a house my brilliant wife paid for. Monica checked her diamond-studded watch and complained that the construction dust was ruining her pores. She grabbed her leather handbag and announced she was heading to the luxury day spa downtown for a mud wrap and a massage. She looked at me coldly and told me to just stay out of the plumber's way and make sure he did not track dirty mud on the expensive Persian rugs in the foyer. Bradley grabbed his leather briefcase, muttering about a crucial business meeting he could not miss with some private equity investors. Within 10 minutes, the heavy front door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the sudden, suffocating silence of the house. Half an hour later, a white panel van pulled into the circular driveway. It was Pete Reynolds, a local independent plumber I had known for nearly 15 years. Pete was a good, honest family man who had done the plumbing work when Cynthia first expanded our kitchen back in the day. I met him at the door and led him down the long hallway toward the locked office. I turned the brass key in the heavy oak door, and the familiar scent of Cynthia's drafting paper and faint lavender perfume hit me like a physical blow. I pointed to a random corner behind her large mahogany desk and told Pete I suspected a slow, hidden leak behind the drywall right there. I felt terribly guilty for lying to a good man, but I handed him a $50 bill right off the bat and told him to take his time investigating. I explained that I needed to clear my head and that I was heading down to the community church for my weekly senior support group. I told him to just lock the front door if he finished before I got back. Pete smiled, warmly took off his canvas work cap, and promised he would take good care of the place. I walked out to my old sedan, the only car I was allowed to drive these days, without Bradley constantly criticizing my insurance rates. I drove the familiar route to the church, watching the autumn leaves blow across the quiet suburban streets. I just needed 1 hour of peace. 1 hour away from the constant belittling and the suffocating toxic presence of my son. I pulled into the church parking lot and put the car in park. I was just reaching for the door handle when my cell phone vibrated violently in the cup holder. The caller ID showed it was Pete. I answered, expecting him to tell me he could not find a single drop of water. Instead, his voice came through the speaker, shaking and totally breathless. He bypassed any polite greeting. He just said, "Wally, you need to come home right now." I asked him if a pipe had burst and flooded the floor. He lowered his voice to a frantic whisper and said, "No, Wally, I found something inside the hollow wall, something your wife had been hiding. But you need to come alone. Do not bring your son. Do not tell anyone. Just get here now." My blood ran completely cold. I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing against the asphalt as I sped back toward the house, initiating a chain of events that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The drive back from the church was a blur of gray asphalt and rising panic. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Pete, the plumber, had sounded genuinely terrified on the phone, and Pete was not a man easily rattled. I pulled my old sedan into the driveway, with the tires crunching loudly against the loose gravel. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, a quiet suburban brick colonial surrounded by neat hedges. But inside everything had changed. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet car for a few seconds, forcing my breathing to steady. I had to be prepared for whatever disaster awaited me. I pushed open the heavy wooden front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was dead silent. There were no sounds of construction and no humming power tools. The only smell was the lingering scent of drywall dust and Monica luxury floral perfume. I walked down the long hallway toward my late wife office. Each step felt incredibly heavy, as if gravity itself was trying to keep me away from that room. I found Pete standing completely still in the center of the office. He had already packed all his heavy wrenches and pipes back into his canvas tool bag. His usually ruddy face was pale, and a thin layer of sweat coated his forehead. He looked at me with wide eyes and swallowed hard. He pointed a trembling finger toward the far wall just behind where Cynthia used to keep her massive oak drafting table. The drywall there had been neatly cut open, revealing a dark, hollow space between the wooden load-bearing studs. I asked him what happened, trying to keep my own voice from shaking. Pete wiped his hands nervously on his denim overalls and took a step back toward the door. He told me he was just tapping the wall looking for the damp spot I had lied about. But instead of a dull thud, his knuckles hit something cold and solid, echoing with a heavy metallic ring. He said he took his sharp utility knife and cut away a small square of plaster just to see if there was a hidden electrical junction box or a blocked ventilation duct. When he shined his flashlight into the dark cavity, he realized it was not plumbing at all. Pete looked around the quiet house nervously, as if he expected my son Bradley to jump out from behind the door and attack him. He told me he did not want any trouble. He said whatever was hidden behind that wall was way above his pay grade, and he did not want to be involved in any weird family secrets or legal messes. I could see the genuine discomfort in his posture. He just wanted to leave and pretend he had never come here. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. I pressed the money into his rough, calloused hands. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he had done a great job finding the leak and that he had fixed it perfectly. I told him he never saw anything else inside this house. Pete nodded quickly, shoving the money deep into his front pocket. He grabbed his heavy tool bag and practically ran down the hallway. I heard the front door open and shut with a solid, heavy click. A moment later, his van engine roared to life and he sped out of the driveway, leaving me entirely alone. I walked slowly across the plush carpet toward the exposed section of the wall. Fine white dust floated in the air, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window blinds. I crouched down and peered into the jagged hole Pete had cut. The darkness inside the wall was deep, but I could clearly see the smooth, matte black surface of solid forged steel. It was not a small lockbox or a cheap fire safe you could buy at a local hardware store. From the curve of the metal and the heavy reinforced hinges, bolted directly into the foundation, I could tell this was a massive custom-built security vault. It was floor-to-ceiling steel, completely hidden behind the innocent-looking floral wallpaper. My mind raced, trying to process the sheer scale of the deception. Cynthia must have hired private security contractors while I was away visiting my brother in Ohio 2 years ago. She had this impenetrable fortress installed right under my nose, and she never breathed a single word of it to me. I needed to see the whole thing. I could not wait another second. I grabbed Pete's discarded utility knife from the floor and jammed the sharp blade into the drywall. I dragged it downward using all my upper body strength to carve a long vertical line. The plaster crumbled and snapped under the pressure. I dropped the knife and dug my bare fingers into the crack, grabbing the edge of the drywall and pulling backward with everything I had. My muscles burned and my joints popped, but I did not stop. A massive sheet of plasterboard tore away from the wooden studs, crashing loudly to the floor in a cloud of blinding white dust. I coughed and waved my hands frantically, clearing the air. When the dust finally settled, I stood up and stared at the monolith in front of me. The safe was enormous. It was a dark, imposing iron giant standing silently in the wreckage of the beautiful room. It looked like a bank vault meant to survive a hurricane. In the exact center of the heavy steel door was a sleek digital keypad. The black glass screen was completely blank, waiting for an input. There was no keyhole and no manual override handle. It required a specific sequence of numbers to release the internal locking mechanism. I reached out and gently touched the cold surface of the screen. A bright blue light instantly illuminated the keypad, casting a strange glow on my dusty hands. I stared at the glowing numbers, feeling a sudden wave of deep, crushing doubt. Why would Cynthia do this? What could she possibly possess that required a bank-grade vault inside our own home? More importantly, how was I supposed to open it? I had absolutely no idea what code she would use. My first instinct was to try the most obvious choices. I typed in my own birthday. The blue light flashed an angry red, and the machine let out a sharp, denying beep. I cleared the screen and tried Cynthia birthday. Another red flash and another angry beep. I stood there staring at the numbers, feeling incredibly foolish. Of course she would not use our birthdays. Cynthia was far too smart for that. She spent her entire life designing secure commercial buildings and government facilities. She understood security protocols better than anyone I ever knew. If she built a hidden vault to protect something vital, she would never use a combination that our son Bradley could easily guess. Bradley knew our birthdays and he knew our wedding anniversary. He knew my social security number and my banking pins. If Bradley ever found this safe, he would try those numbers first. Cynthia knew that better than anyone. She needed a number that was significant only to the two of us, but entirely invisible to our greedy son. I closed my eyes and tried to channel her way of thinking. I thought about the woman I loved. I thought about her sharp analytical mind and her ruthless pragmatism. What was the most important day of her life? It was not the day we got married. We loved each other deeply, but we both knew our wedding was just a beautiful formality. The defining moment of Cynthia's life, the day she truly took control of her own destiny, was the day she legally incorporated her architectural firm. She had faced endless rejections from male-dominated construction companies. They laughed at her designs and dismissed her immense talent. So she gathered every penny we had saved, took out a massive loan against this very house, and started her own company. I was the only person who supported her. I was the one who drove her to the state capitol building on a freezing Tuesday morning in 1984. I sat in the hard wooden chair in the lobby, holding her heavy winter coat, while she marched into the clerk office and signed the incorporation papers that changed our lives forever. That date was the cornerstone of her entire empire. It was her true anniversary of independence. Bradley did not even know the exact year she started the company, because he was too busy spending the money she earned to care about how she built her legacy. But I knew. I remembered it like it was yesterday. October 14th, 1984. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing blue keypad. My hands were no longer shaking. I reached out with a steady finger and pressed the number 1. A small click echoed in the quiet room. I pressed 0, then 1, then 4. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I finished the sequence typing in 1984. The blue light on the keypad suddenly turned a brilliant glowing green. A heavy motorized hum vibrated from deep inside the steel door. I held my breath as 4 massive steel locking bolts retracted into the door frame with a loud final, heavy clack. The digital screen went dark, and the heavy steel handle popped out automatically. She trusted me. Even from beyond the grave, she knew I would remember the day we risked everything to build her dream. She knew I paid attention to the details that our son ignored. I grabbed the cold steel handle and pulled backward with all my weight. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled silent hinges, revealing the dark interior. The air inside the vault rushed out, carrying the distinct smell of fresh paper and dried ink. I leaned forward, stepping into the threshold of whatever secret she had left behind, ready to face the storm that was about to break. The air inside the vault felt remarkably cool against my sweating face. I reached my hands into the dark space. There were no stacks of cash or velvet jewelry boxes. Instead, resting on the smooth steel floor was a thick manila folder bulging with documents. Next to it sat a small silver thumb drive and a crisp white envelope. My name was written across the center of the envelope in black ink. It was Cynthia, elegant, sloping handwriting. Just seeing the shape of my name written by her hand made my chest tighten, with a grief so sharp it stole my breath. I grabbed the folder, the drive, and the envelope, pulling them out into the light of the wrecked office. I sat down heavily in the leather chair behind her drafting table. My knees were shaking too much to keep standing. I set the heavy dossier and the thumb drive on the desk. I held the white envelope in both hands. I carefully slid my thumb under the flap, tearing it open. Inside was a 3-page letter written on her heavy stock professional stationery. The date at the top was nearly a year ago. That was exactly 4 months before she finally sat me down in the living room and told me she was sick. I started to read. Her voice echoed clearly in my mind with every word. She started by apologizing. She wrote that she knew about the pancreatic cancer a full 6 months before she ever told me or the doctors. She said she felt the pain and saw the signs, but she chose to suffer in absolute silence. Reading that made me sob out loud in the quiet room. I could not understand why she would carry that terrifying burden alone. Why she would shut me out when I would have done anything to comfort her. But the next paragraph answered my question with a truth so brutal it made my blood run cold. Cynthia wrote that she did not hide her illness to protect my feelings. She hid it because she needed time. She needed a head start to protect my actual life. She explained that shortly before her diagnosis, she had noticed strange discrepancies in some of our joint bank accounts. Small withdrawals and strange credit inquiries. Because she was a meticulous architect, she started digging into the numbers. What she found was a nightmare. Our son Bradley was not just bad with his money. He was entirely broke and drowning in debt. And it was not standard credit card debt. Bradley had taken massive loans from unregulated private equity lenders to fund his lavish lifestyle and his failing business ventures. These were dangerous men who demanded immediate repayment, and they were threatening to destroy him. I gripped the edges of the letter so tightly the paper crumpled. My own son was in bed with financial predators. But Cynthia's next words hit me even harder. She wrote that Bradley had a plan to save himself. He was going to use our money to pay off his debts. Since Cynthia controlled the primary wealth, he knew he could not touch it while she was alive and healthy. But he knew her diagnosis would change everything. Cynthia had hired a private investigator to look into Bradley computer records. She found emails between Bradley and a sleazy estate lawyer. They had already drafted fraudulent medical documents to declare me legally incompetent. They were planning to claim I was suffering from severe dementia. Bradley's entire strategy was to wait for Cynthia to die, swoop in as my legal guardian, institutionalize me, and immediately liquidate this house and every single asset we owned to save his own skin. I stopped reading for a moment. The silence of the house felt heavy and suffocating. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with his history homework, was actively plotting to lock me away in a facility and steal the life my wife built. He was not just arrogant or greedy. He was a complete monster. The casual cruelty of his plan made me physically sick. Everything made sense now. The patronizing way he spoke to me. The way he and Monica moved into the house uninvited. They were just setting the stage. They were establishing their presence so they could easily take over when the trap finally snapped shut. The realization of what Bradley had done kept washing over me in dark, suffocating waves. I sat in the quiet office and stared at the framed photographs on the wall. There was a picture of Bradley fishing with me at the lake when he was 12 years old. He had been smiling so brightly, holding up a tiny sunfish like it was a grand prize. I tried to connect that innocent boy to the man who was currently plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. It was impossible. The greed had entirely consumed him. He had watched his mother slowly waste away from a terrible disease, and instead of grieving, he had used her declining health as a convenient distraction to set up his own financial heist. He probably sat by her hospital bed, calculating the exact monetary value of her last breath. The sheer sociopathy of his plan was staggering. I wiped my eyes and forced myself to keep reading. Cynthia wrote that she was furious, but she was not going to let a spoiled child destroy the man she loved. She spent the last healthy months of her life executing a masterclass in legal warfare. She explained that the thick manila folder on the desk was the key to my survival. She had quietly hired the most aggressive corporate law firm in the state. Together, they drafted a secondary irrevocable trust. She explained the mechanics of the trap in simple terms, so I would understand exactly what to do. The trust she had set up years ago, the one Bradley knew about, and was planning to raid, was completely intact, but it was now entirely empty. Before she died, Cynthia had legally transferred every single asset we owned into a brand new shadow corporation. The house, the savings, the investment portfolios, Everything was now the exclusive property of this new entity. And according to the documents inside the folder, I was the sole controlling director of that corporation. I opened the manila folder and began to leaf through the legal documents just as Cynthia had instructed. The paperwork was dense and intimidating, but Cynthia had attached bright yellow sticky notes to the most critical pages, summarizing the legal jargon in her familiar, neat handwriting. She had named the Shadow Corporation the Phoenix Holdings Trust. It was a fitting name. Out of the ashes of her death and the wreckage of our family, she had engineered a resurrection for me. I read through the clauses carefully. The genius of the Shadow Corporation was not just that it hid the money. It was designed to actively legally trap anyone who tried to interfere with it. Cynthia's sticky notes explained that if Bradley presented his forged power of attorney to the banks, holding the old empty accounts, the system would automatically generate a silent alarm. The banks were legally bound to notify the State Financial Crimes Division immediately, because the old accounts were now flagged as bait under the new corporate structure. Bradley thought he was going to quietly slip the money into his private equity lenders' pockets. Instead, he was going to flag himself to the federal authorities the exact second he submitted the paperwork. He was laying his own noose, and Cynthia had designed the perfect scaffold. Cynthia wrote that Bradley was going to think he won. She left the old will and the old trust documents exactly where he could find them. She wanted him to feel confident. She wanted him to commit his crimes and show his true colors. The letter explicitly stated that I needed to let Bradley walk right up to the edge of the cliff. She told me to let him try to seize the accounts. She told me to let him try to sell the house. Because the absolute second he attempted to transfer those assets, his fraudulent actions would trigger an automatic federal investigation for wire fraud and the theft of non-existent funds. I reached out and placed my hand over the heavy manila folder. It felt like a loaded weapon. Inside were the articles of incorporation, the new property deeds, and the contact information for the aggressive litigators she had retained on my behalf. The silver thumb drive contained all the digital evidence the private investigator had gathered against Bradley, including his emails with the corrupt lawyer and the threatening messages from his private lenders. Cynthia had thought of absolutely everything. She had built a fortress around me while she was dying, and she had handed me the keys. The final paragraph of her letter broke my heart all over again, but it also filled me with a cold, burning strength. She wrote that she loved me more than life itself. She thanked me for being the only person who always believed in her. But then her tone shifted back to the ruthless architect who built an empire. She ordered me not to show Bradley any mercy. She warned me that he would cry and beg and use my love against me when he finally realized he was trapped. She wrote, "Wally, you must remember that he stopped being our son the moment he decided to treat your life as a disposable asset. Do not mourn the boy he was. Destroy the man he has become. I love you forever. Now go make them pay." I carefully folded the letter and slid it into my shirt pocket right over my heart. I looked at the silver thumb drive resting on the dark wood of the desk. I knew I had to secure it. If Bradley ever got his hands on that drive, the evidence of his premeditated fraud could be destroyed. I slipped the drive into my front pocket alongside my house keys. I then started to carefully pack the legal documents back into the manila folder. Every rustle of the thick paper felt like a declaration of war. I was no longer the frail, grieving widower hiding from his abusive family. I was the controlling director of Phoenix Holdings, and I was holding a royal flush. I stood up from the leather chair. My knees were no longer shaking. A profound, icy calm had settled over me. I walked back over to the gaping hole in the wall. I needed to hide the safe again, at least temporarily. Bradley and Monica could not know about this vault until the trap was completely sprung. I carefully lifted the large broken piece of drywall and fit it back into the wall like a giant, jagged puzzle piece. It did not look perfect, but it covered the dark steel of the vault. I dragged a heavy wooden bookshelf across the carpet, positioning it directly in front of the broken drywall to conceal the damage entirely. It was a temporary fix, but it would hold for a few days. Bradley never came into this room anyway. He respected absolutely nothing in this house. I looked around the office one last time, making sure I had left no traces of my discovery. I wiped the dust from my hands and adjusted my collar. Cynthia had done the heavy lifting. She had suffered in silence to buy me this ammunition. Now it was my turn to execute the final blueprint. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and pressed the call button for the ruthless estate litigator she had mentioned in her letter. The phone rang twice before a deep, sharp voice answered the line. The game had officially begun. I felt an incredible surge of triumph coursing through my veins as I placed the heavy manila folder down on the drafting table. The crushing weight of grief and the suffocating feeling of victimhood that had been drowning me for the past 6 months was suddenly gone. Cynthia had given me the ultimate weapon from beyond the grave. I was no longer a helpless old man waiting to be discarded by his own flesh and blood. I was the architect of my own salvation. But before I picked up the black burner phone to call the corporate litigator she had recommended, I decided I needed to check my personal checking account. I wanted to see exactly how much liquid cash I had available to pay Mitchell Reed his initial retainer fee. I left the secret office, making sure the heavy oak door was firmly locked behind me, and walked down the hallway to the kitchen. The house was still completely silent, but the silence no longer felt oppressive or lonely. It felt like the quiet anticipation before a storm that I was finally going to control. I walked over to the kitchen island and opened my small silver laptop, waiting impatiently for the system to boot up. I navigated to the website of our primary banking institution. This was the bank that held my retirement pension, my monthly Social Security deposits, and the modest savings I had built from my long career as a high school history teacher. I carefully typed in my username and my password. My fingers moved quickly across the plastic keys, fueled by a new sense of purpose and clarity. I pressed the enter button and leaned back on the wooden kitchen stool, waiting for the familiar dashboard to load. But the screen did not show my account balances. It did not show my recent transactions or my direct deposits. Instead, the entire monitor turned a stark, glaring white with a thick red banner stripped across the top of the web page. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the bold, black text inside the red warning banner. It read, "Access denied account, frozen by authorized power of attorney." My heart performed a violent stuttering leap in my chest. I blinked rapidly, thinking it must be a computer glitch or a routing error from the bank servers. I refreshed the web page. The red banner remained completely unchanged. I quickly opened a new internet tab and navigated to the website for my secondary emergency credit card. I typed in those credentials and hit enter. The exact same message appeared, blocking me completely from my own financial lifeline. Account frozen by authorized power of attorney. The glorious surge of triumphant energy I had felt just moments ago evaporated instantly. It was violently replaced by a cold, sickening dread that started deep in my stomach and radiated out to the very tips of my fingers. Bradley had not waited. Cynthia had built her brilliant legal trap, assuming he would wait for the right moment after her death to strike. But Bradley was far more ruthless and impatient than either of us had ever anticipated. He had not just planned to steal the estate eventually. He had already pulled the trigger. He had already enacted the fraudulent medical documents and filed them with the state banking authority. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the glowing screen, trying to comprehend how he could have accomplished this without a formal medical evaluation. I had not been to a doctor in over a year. Then a dark, terrible memory surfaced in my mind, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. 2 weeks ago, Bradley had invited a man to the house for a casual Sunday dinner. Bradley introduced him as an old college buddy who was now a private practice physician. The man was overly friendly, smiling constantly, and asking me strange, pointed questions over the roast chicken. He asked me to recount the specific details of my last vacation with Cynthia. He asked me who the current president of the country was, and he made a laughing joke about me counting backward from 100 in multiples of 7. I thought he was just an eccentric conversationalist, trying to make small talk. I had absolutely no idea I was sitting through a stealth cognitive evaluation right in my own dining room. That corrupt doctor must have signed the medical affidavits declaring me completely incompetent and a severe danger to my own financial well-being. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as the terrifying reality of my situation set in. I was legally dead in the eyes of the financial system. I had no money to buy a gallon of milk, let alone hire a high-powered corporate litigator to fight my son in court. If I called the police right now, Bradley would simply show them the forged legal documents and tell the officers that his poor father was suffering from severe dementia delusions. I was entirely at the mercy of the man who was actively trying to destroy me. I reached with a trembling hand and opened my personal email account. I rarely used it these days, but I desperately needed to see if the bank or the county had sent any prior warnings that I had missed. My inbox was full of promotional junk, but one single email from a local county property registry caught my eye. Years ago, Cynthia had set up an automated alert for our home address just to monitor neighborhood property values. I clicked on the bold subject line with a sickening feeling in my throat. The email was an automated public notification that the deed status of our residential property had been officially updated. I scrolled down, reading the attached digital flyer. The remaining breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Our family home was not just being prepped for a future sale. It was already actively listed in a private wholesale real estate network, and it was marked as a pending transaction. The buyer was listed as an anonymous corporate holding company, but it was the closing date at the bottom of the page that made the kitchen spin dangerously around me. The final transfer of the property the day the new owners took absolute legal possession was scheduled for this coming Friday. That was exactly 4 days from today. Bradley was going to sell the house right out from under me to cover his massive debts to his dangerous private equity lenders. In exactly 96 hours, men with legal authority would arrive at my front door to physically remove me from the only home I had left. Bradley was probably going to have a medical transport van waiting in the circular driveway to haul me off to some miserable state-run psychiatric facility where I would be heavily medicated and forgotten forever. The timeline had violently shrunk. I did not have weeks or months to play a slow, careful game of chess against my son. I was locked out of my own life, and the executioners were already marching toward my front door. I pushed myself away from the kitchen island and ran back down the hallway toward the locked office. I grabbed the black burner phone from the drafting table. The game was no longer just about teaching my greedy son a lesson about respect. It was a desperate, ticking clock fight for my absolute survival. I sat in the worn leather armchair by the living room window, watching the late afternoon sun cast long, creeping shadows across the front lawn. My heart was still racing violently against my ribs from the terrifying discovery in the kitchen, but I forced my breathing to slow down to a steady, rhythmic pace. I had to completely bury the sharp, capable man who had just uncovered a massive financial conspiracy. I needed to wrap myself tightly in the pathetic, fragile skin that my son had so carefully crafted for me. I slumped my shoulders forward, allowing my spine to curve awkwardly against the heavy fabric of the chair. I let my jaw hang slightly slack and unfocused, my eyes staring blankly at the large oak tree near the edge of the driveway. I was no longer the controlling director of a shadow corporation holding the legal keys to their absolute destruction. I was just an exhausted, confused old man, waiting out his final days in a house he no longer recognized. Nearly an hour later, the aggressive roaring sound of an expensive sports car engine shattered the quiet suburban neighborhood. Bradley pulled his silver convertible right onto the edge of Cynthia's carefully manicured front lawn, not even bothering to park properly in the paved driveway. Monica climbed out of the passenger side, carrying 3 oversized shopping bags from high-end luxury boutiques downtown. They walked up the brick path, laughing loudly together about something entirely trivial. I listened to the heavy thud of the front door opening and the sharp, aggressive click of Monica designer heels striking the hardwood floor of the foyer. The hostile invasion of my sanctuary had officially resumed. They did not immediately come into the living room to check on my well-being. Instead, I heard them move directly into the kitchen, casually opening heavy cabinet doors and pouring themselves expensive drinks. Monica was complaining loudly about the young masseuse at the luxury spa, claiming the woman had applied entirely too much pressure to her shoulders and completely ruined her afternoon of relaxation. She then seamlessly shifted her complaints to the physical state of our kitchen, declaring that the dark granite countertops looked completely outdated and depressing. I listened to my daughter-in-law mentally renovating a house she had absolutely no legal right to inhabit, using money she firmly believed they were about to steal from my fraudulent committal to a state facility. She loudly proclaimed that they needed to hire a premium private contractor to install imported white Italian marble before the upcoming weekend, so the house would look presentable for their wealthy friends. Bradley quickly chimed in, his voice thick with unearned arrogance and deep entitlement. He told her not to worry about any of the upcoming renovation costs because his crucial business meeting with the private equity investors had gone flawlessly that afternoon. He bragged openly to his wife that the final financial paperwork was practically a done deal and that they were going to be completely flush with untraceable cash by Friday afternoon. He actually laughed a sharp, cruel sound that echoed down the hallway and said the clueless old man would not even know what hit him when the moving trucks finally arrived. Hearing my own flesh and blood openly celebrate the total destruction of my life while standing less than 20 feet away from me required a level of supreme physical and mental control I never knew I possessed. I wanted to march straight into that kitchen, grab him by the collar of his expensive silk shirt, and scream the absolute truth right into his face. I wanted to watch his smug, confident expression shatter into a million pieces when I told him the accounts were permanently rigged and the house belonged to an ironclad trust he could never ever touch. But I remembered the strict, ruthless instructions Cynthia had left for me in her handwritten letter hidden inside the steel vault. She told me to let him walk right up to the bare edge of the cliff before I pushed him over. So I stayed perfectly still in the leather armchair, continuing to stare blankly out the living room window, like a discarded piece of old furniture. A few moments later, Bradley strolled confidently into the living room, holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch that he had casually poured from my private locked liquor cabinet. He stopped right in the middle of the room, looking down at me with an expression of deep, calculated fake pity. He walked over and stood directly beside my chair, intentionally blocking my warm view of the afternoon sun. I slowly looked up at his face, making absolutely sure my eyes appeared dull, lifeless, and completely lost in the present moment. I let my right hand rest heavily on the wooden arm of the chair, and I intentionally initiated a slight rhythmic tremor in my fingers. It was a subtle physical detail, but I knew Bradley was constantly looking for any visual sign to logically justify his forged medical documents to the outside world. He stared down at my shaking hand for a long moment, and a cruel, deeply satisfied smile twitched at the very corners of his mouth. He reached out and placed his heavy hand on my shoulder, giving it a firm, condescending pat that felt more like a physical threat than a gesture of comfort. He spoke to me in that sickeningly sweet, high-pitched tone people usually reserve for confused toddlers or stray injured animals. He asked me how I was feeling today, and if the scary, loud plumber had made entirely too much noise while fixing the imaginary pipe in the hallway. I simply nodded once, keeping my mouth firmly closed and my jaw locked tight so I would not accidentally spit pure venom at him. Bradley took a slow, deliberate sip of his stolen scotch and sighed dramatically, as if he carried the entire weight of the world on his shoulders. He told me that Monica and he had been talking seriously for weeks, and they had finally made a very important and loving decision regarding my immediate future. He said they realized this big house was just getting way too large and far too confusing for me to navigate safely on my own anymore. He claimed they were losing sleep at night, worried I might wander off into the street or accidentally fall and hurt myself on the steep oak staircase. He kept his large hand firmly pressed on my shoulder, applying just enough downward pressure to make it abundantly clear that I was entirely under his physical and legal control. Then he delivered the final devastating piece of his sick master puzzle. He told me that they had personally booked a private VIP tour at a lovely luxury assisted living facility located 2 full counties over. He described the place as a wonderful, quiet paradise with round-the-clock nurses, beautiful blooming gardens, and daily supervised activities where I could finally rest without having any stressful adult responsibilities. He said the mandatory introductory tour was scheduled for this coming Friday morning, right after breakfast. Friday. The exact same day, the anonymous private equity buyers were scheduled to arrive and finalize the wholesale purchase of my family home. His master plan was brutally efficient and entirely devoid of human empathy. He was going to pack me into the passenger seat of his car, drive me miles away from my own community, and leave me permanently trapped in a locked medical ward while the fraudulent real estate sale closed back here in the comfort of my own living room. He squeezed my shoulder one last time and asked me if that did not sound like a really nice, relaxing change of pace for a tired old man. I looked slowly up into the cold, dead eyes of the boy I had raised and protected for his entire life. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was absolutely staggering, but it was matched only by the sheer magnitude of his absolute, blinding stupidity. He truly and deeply believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he had successfully outmaneuvered his brilliant architect mother and completely neutralized his helpless retired father. He had absolutely no idea he was standing in a house he did not legally own, drinking imported liquors he could not afford, and actively celebrating a massive financial victory that was mathematically and legally impossible to achieve. The boiling rage inside my chest was a living, breathing thing, threatening to claw its way right up my throat and expose my true strength. But I swallowed the anger down, burying it deep beneath the flawless facade of the broken, defeated old man. I stopped the fake physical tremor in my right hand and slowly let my head droop forward toward my chest, as if I simply lacked the basic physical energy to argue with his brilliant logic anymore. I gave him exactly what he desperately needed to see to permanently seal his own grim fate. I murmured a very quiet, incredibly tired, "Okay," to the empty room. Bradley patted my shoulder one last time, his dark mission fully accomplished. He turned around without another word and walked happily back toward the kitchen, whistling a cheerful, upbeat tune to join his waiting wife. I sat completely alone in the fading gray light of the living room, listening to them toast their glasses and celebrate my absolute demise. My silence was not an act of submission or defeat. It was the deliberate loading of a heavy weapon. I had exactly 3 days left to survive this agonizing psychological performance, but I knew exactly how this entire story was going to end. On Friday morning, I was certainly not going to be the one taking a permanent, miserable trip away from this beautiful house. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 12 times. Each heavy gong resonated through the floorboards of my bedroom. I lay perfectly still on my back, staring up at the dark ceiling. I had spent the entire evening playing the role of the docile, defeated father, eating a silent dinner while Bradley and Monica practically planned their early retirement right in front of my face. The sheer mental exhaustion of maintaining that pathetic facade was heavier than any physical labor I had ever done. But the moment the final chime faded into the silence of the house, I threw off the heavy wool blanket. The waiting was over. It was time to move. I dressed quickly in the dark, pulling on a thick wool sweater and dark trousers. I slid my feet into my worn leather loafers, bypassing my loud boots so my footsteps would remain entirely silent. I reached under my mattress and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone I had taken from Cynthia's hidden vault, along with the thick manila folder holding her ultimate master plan. The phone felt entirely foreign in my hands. It was a cheap, disposable piece of plastic, completely untraceable and fully charged. I slipped it into my deep coat pocket, along with the heavy folder, and quietly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. I crept past the master bedroom where Bradley and Monica were fast asleep. I could actually hear the faint, rhythmic sound of Bradley snoring through the thick oak door. He was sleeping the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who believed he had absolutely no enemies in the world. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his criminal enterprise. I felt a cold, hard knot of pure adrenaline tighten in my stomach as I walked past his door. I descended the wooden staircase, stepping carefully on the extreme outer edges of the steps to avoid the familiar creaks and groans of the old wood. I bypassed the front door entirely, knowing the heavy deadbolt would make a loud metallic clack that might echo up the stairwell. Instead, I moved silently through the dark kitchen and slipped out through the sliding glass patio door in the back. The crisp night air hit my face instantly, clearing the lingering fog of the suffocating house. I walked quickly across the damp grass of the backyard, slipping through the wooden side gate and stepping out onto the empty suburban sidewalk. I did not stop walking until I was a full 3 blocks away, standing beneath the flickering orange glow of a broken street lamp. I pulled the small burner phone from my pocket. My hands were completely steady. I pressed the power button and watched the small screen illuminate the darkness. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the crisp white business card that had been stapled to the front of Cynthia's legal dossier. The card was stark and minimalist. It simply read, Mitchell Reed, Senior Partner, Corporate and Estate Litigation, along with a direct cell phone number. No fancy logos and no desperate marketing slogans. It was the card of a man who did not need to advertise because his reputation did all the heavy lifting. I carefully dialed the 10-digit number into the glowing keypad. It was 10 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday. I fully expected the call to go straight to a generic corporate voicemail. But the phone only rang twice before the line clicked open. There was no polite greeting and no sleepy confusion. A deep, gravelly voice answered immediately, asking who was calling on this secure line. The voice was sharp, alert, and entirely dangerous. It sounded like a man who was intimately accustomed to receiving desperate phone calls in the dead of night. I took a deep breath of the cold night air. I told him my name was Wallace Montgomery. I told him I was the husband of the late Cynthia Montgomery, and I was calling him from a clean, unregistered phone exactly as she had instructed. For a long, agonizing moment, there was absolute dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background on his end. Then I heard the sound of a heavy leather chair squeaking, as if the man had suddenly sat up entirely straight. When Mitchell finally spoke again, his tone had completely shifted. The dangerous, aggressive edge was still there, but it was suddenly laced with a profound, deep respect. Mitchell Reed let out a long, heavy sigh. He told me he had been waiting for this exact phone call for over 6 months. He said he attended Cynthia's funeral and stood in the back row watching my son Bradley put on a pathetic fake display of grief. He told me he knew the day was coming when Bradley would finally make his move and try to steal the estate. I asked him how he knew so much about my family nightmare. That was when Mitchell revealed the true depth of Cynthia's brilliant foresight and the unbreakable bond she had forged with this ruthless lawyer. Mitchell told me a story about a time 15 years ago when he was just a hungry junior partner at a highly prestigious but deeply corrupt law firm downtown. He said a massive scandal had erupted involving the senior partners embezzling millions of dollars from their wealthy corporate clients. Mitchell had absolutely nothing to do with the theft, but his name was on the letterhead, and the media was trying to completely destroy his career by association. Every single major client abandoned him, instantly terrified of the bad press. His career was entirely ruined, and he was facing total personal bankruptcy. But Cynthia did not run. At the time, she was his biggest client, holding massive commercial real estate contracts that were the absolute lifeblood of his firm. The other partners begged her to take her business elsewhere to protect her own reputation. But Cynthia had looked right at Mitchell and saw a decent man who was being unfairly destroyed by the greed of others. She publicly refused to pull her accounts. She stood in front of a room full of aggressive reporters and staked her entire professional reputation on Mitchell's personal integrity. Her public show of absolute faith was the only thing that kept the wolves at bay. She single-handedly saved his career, his firm, and his life. Mitchell's voice grew incredibly quiet over the phone. He told me he swore a blood oath to my wife that day. He promised her that if she ever needed a loaded weapon in a legal fight, he would be the one to pull the trigger for her. He told me Cynthia had come to him secretly a year ago right after she got her cancer diagnosis. She laid out the entire Shadow Trust strategy on his desk and asked him to be the designated executioner when her greedy son finally stepped into the trap. Mitchell told me he owed Cynthia everything he had, and by extension, he owed me absolute loyalty. He said, "Wally, you are not a client to me, you are family, and we are going to burn this kid to the ground." A massive wave of relief washed over me so powerfully, my knees actually buckled slightly. I leaned against the cold metal pole of the street lamp, holding the phone tight to my ear. I finally had a real ally. I was no longer fighting this terrifying war alone in the dark. I told Mitchell we had a severe escalation in the timeline. I explained what I had discovered on the banking website that very afternoon. I told him Bradley had already forged the medical documents, enacted a fraudulent power of attorney, and permanently frozen every single one of my liquid accounts. I told him the wholesale buyers were scheduled to arrive this coming Friday morning to finalize the illegal purchase of the house. I fully expected Mitchell to panic or tell me that the timeline was entirely too tight for us to file the proper injunctions. Instead, I heard a low, dark chuckle rumble through the phone speaker. It was the sound of a predator smelling blood in the water. Mitchell did not sound worried at all. He sounded absolutely thrilled. He told me that Bradley moving aggressively was the greatest mistake the boy could have possibly made. He explained that by officially filing that forged power of attorney with the state banking authority, Bradley had just crossed the line from petty family theft into major federal wire fraud. Mitchell told me that Cynthia Trap was already perfectly set, but we needed to review the physical documents inside the manila folder to coordinate the final strike. He said we could not wait until morning, and we certainly could not risk Bradley catching us talking on the phone. He ordered me to walk to a specific 24-hour diner located about 2 miles away from my neighborhood. He told me to sit in the back corner booth, order a black coffee, and wait for him to arrive. He promised he would be there in exactly 30 minutes. I hung up the burner phone and slipped it back into my heavy coat pocket. I looked back down the dark street toward the house where my son was peacefully sleeping. His reign of terror was officially coming to an end. I pulled my collar up against the cold wind and started walking confidently into the night. The neon sign outside the diner flickered with a dull red glow, casting long, terrifying shadows across the empty, cracked asphalt of the parking lot. It was almost 3 in the morning, and the air was bitterly cold, biting through my thick wool sweater. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the restaurant. A small brass bell chimed above my head, but the sound was completely swallowed by the loud hum of an old refrigerator unit and the overwhelming smell of stale coffee and fried grease. The place was entirely deserted, except for a tired waitress wiping down the front counter with a wet rag and a single man sitting quietly in the very back corner booth. I knew it was Mitchell Reed immediately. He did not look like a man who had been dragged out of his warm bed in the middle of the night. He wore a sharply tailored dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his eyes were completely awake, scanning the room with the intense, calculated focus of a hunting hawk. I walked over slowly and slid into the cracked vinyl booth directly across from him. He did not offer a warm handshake or a polite late-night greeting. He simply reached his hand across the sticky surface of the table, his palm facing upward. I reached into my deep coat pocket, pulled out the heavy manila folder and the small silver thumb drive, and placed them directly into his waiting hand. Mitchell ordered a black coffee from the approaching waitress and waited in absolute silence until she walked away back to the kitchen before he opened the folder. I watched his dark eyes track back and forth across the thick legal pages. He read with terrifying speed, absorbing the dense corporate jargon like he was reading a simple children's book. Every few minutes he would pause, flip back to a bright yellow sticky note Cynthia had written in her elegant handwriting, and let out a low, quiet whistle of pure professional admiration. He then plugged the silver thumb drive into a sleek black tablet he had brought with him. He swiped through the digital files my wife had painstakingly gathered, reading the frantic emails between my son Bradley and the corrupt medical evaluator. I sat there, in total silence, gripping my warm ceramic coffee mug, letting the hot steam hit my face. I watched this ruthless corporate litigator process the sheer brilliance of the trap Cynthia had built from her deathbed. When Mitchell finally closed the heavy folder and turned off his glowing tablet, he leaned back against the red vinyl booth and let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked right at me and said, "Your wife was an absolute genius, Wally." He said he had seen Fortune 500 companies with weaker corporate defense structures than the shadow trust she had quietly engineered. He confirmed that the Phoenix Holdings Corporation was completely bulletproof. Every single asset I owned, including the house, the savings, and the retirement accounts, was legally locked away behind a massive wall of titanium. But then his face hardened, and the slight respectful smile completely disappeared from his lips. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper. Mitchell told me that while Cynthia had built a perfect, impenetrable fortress, my son Bradley had dug himself a grave far deeper and far darker than we had originally thought. He tapped his index finger against the silver thumb drive. He told me he recognized the names of the private lenders Bradley was currently dealing with. They were not some local community bank or a standard Wall Street investment firm. They were a highly aggressive offshore private equity group known for completely gutting vulnerable companies and ruining the personal lives of their desperate debtors. Mitchell explained the terrifying reality of the situation. Bradley had essentially leveraged a massive bridge loan using the fraudulent promise of my estate as absolute collateral. The private equity group did not care if Bradley was my biological son or if he had forged the medical documents to steal my property. They only cared about the massive return on their immediate investment. Mitchell told me that these men played for keeps and they did not operate within the normal bounds of civil society. He said if Bradley did not deliver the clean legal title to my house and transfer the liquid funds by this coming Friday afternoon, they would not just sue him in civil court. They would completely and utterly destroy him. They would legally seize his failing business. They would repossess his imported luxury cars, and they would hand over all his fraudulent loan applications directly to the federal authorities to ensure he went to a maximum security federal prison. Bradley was a cornered animal, and he was entirely out of time. That was exactly why he was pushing the fraudulent sale of the house so aggressively. He was desperately trying to pay off violent financial monsters by stealing from his own helpless father. Hearing the absolute reality of my son's situation sent a cold shiver down my spine. Bradley had invited actual predators right to our front door. I felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of vindication mixed with pure adrenaline. I looked at Mitchell and told him we needed to call the local police right now. I told him we should file an immediate emergency injunction with the state court tomorrow morning to block the real estate transaction entirely and get Bradley thrown out of my house before he could even eat his breakfast. I was ready to end this nightmare tonight. But Mitchell quickly raised his hand, stopping me completely. He shook his head slowly and looked me dead in the eye with a gaze so intense it pinned me to the back of the booth. He said, "Wally, if we file a legal injunction right now, Bradley will get an automated notification from the county clerk office. He will instantly realize the trap has been sprung and that his entire plan is compromised." Mitchell warned me that a desperate, cornered man like Bradley, realizing he was about to go to federal prison and lose everything, might do something completely unhinged. He said Bradley might physically destroy the original deed documents out of pure spite, or worse, he might realize his fraudulent medical power of attorney was his only remaining leverage and try to force you into a locked psychiatric facility tonight before the court offices even open. We absolutely cannot risk tipping him off early. Mitchell leaned closer across the table, his voice dropping even lower. He said, "We have to let him think he has completely won. We have to let him bring the private equity buyers right into your living room on Friday morning. We have to let him present the forged medical documents and attempt to sign the final property transfer." Mitchell explained that the second Bradley Penn hits that paper, he commits irreversible federal fraud in front of multiple legal witnesses. That is the exact moment the trap snaps shut entirely, and he can never ever escape. If we strike too early, we just give him a chance to run away or claim it was all a big misunderstanding. We need him to legally hang himself. The brutal reality of his words crashed down on me with the weight of a falling building. Mitchell was absolutely right. To completely destroy Bradley and ensure he could never ever threaten me again, the final crime had to be executed perfectly out in the open. I looked down at my hands resting on the sticky table. They were trembling slightly, but this time it was not an act of fake dementia. It was pure, unadulterated fear. I looked back up at Mitchell and asked him what I was supposed to do until Friday morning. Mitchell looked at me with a mixture of deep sympathy and cold, professional resolve. He said, "You have to go back to that house tonight, Wally. You have to survive the next 3 days living under the same roof with a predator. You have to play the confused, broken old man perfectly. You have to endure every single insult, every condescending pat on the shoulder, and every cruel joke. You cannot show a single ounce of anger, you cannot show any defiance, and you absolutely cannot break character for a single second. If he suspects for even one moment that you know the actual truth, he will panic and he will run." I took a deep breath of the stale diner air, letting the smell of coffee and grease fill my lungs. The thought of walking back into that house, back into the suffocating presence of my son and his greedy wife, made my stomach churn. I would have to sit at the dining table and listen to them celebrate my demise. I would have to watch them pack away my wife's belongings and plan renovations with money they were never going to see. I had to become a ghost in my own life just a little bit longer. But then I thought about Cynthia. I thought about her sitting alone in doctors' offices receiving terrible news and choosing to suffer in absolute silence just to buy me enough time to build this weapon. She had endured unimaginable physical pain to protect me. I could certainly endure 3 more days of psychological torture to honor her final wish. I slowly nodded my head. I told Mitchell I would be ready on Friday morning. I told him I would play the part flawlessly and let Bradley walk himself right to the edge of the cliff. Mitchell smiled a thin, dangerous smile. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black audio recording device. He slid it across the table, telling me to keep it hidden in my pocket and record every single conversation Bradley had over the next 3 days. Every piece of arrogance, every boastful claim would just be another nail in his coffin. I took the device, slipping it safely next to the burner phone. I slid out of the vinyl booth and walked back out into the freezing night, leaving the ruthless litigator to prepare the final execution of my revenge. The game was no longer about defending myself. It was about surviving the wait. Thursday evening arrived like a slow-moving storm, covering the house in a suffocating atmosphere of fake celebration. Bradley and Monica had spent the entire day transforming Cynthia's beautiful home into a garish showroom for their wealthy friends. Strange men in crisp white shirts and black ties moved constantly through the hallway, carrying heavy silver trays of expensive catered food. The delicate scent of roasted lamb and rich, heavy sauces completely masked the familiar, comforting smell of the lavender polish my wife always used on the hardwood floors. Huge, elaborate arrangements of imported white orchids were placed on every available surface. I sat quietly in my leather armchair, watching this elaborate circus unfold, knowing exactly how it was being funded. Bradley had not suddenly come into money. He was actively draining the last available drop of credit from my emergency cards to throw a lavish party celebrating my forced exile from my own home. By 7 o'clock, the doorbell began to ring continuously. Bradley greeted his guests with a booming, arrogant voice playing the role of the incredibly successful and deeply generous host. Monica paraded around the foyer in a brand-new designer silk dress, laughing loudly and accepting compliments on the stunning architecture of the house as if she had laid the bricks with her own two hands. They invited a dozen of their shallow country club friends, people who looked at me with thin, tight smiles and eyes full of fake pity. But there were 3 men who arrived together who did not blend in with the rest of the laughing crowd. They wore dark, immaculate suits and moved with a cold, predatory stiffness. They did not compliment Monica's dress or marvel at the flower arrangements. Instead, their sharp eyes scanned the high ceilings, the custom molding, and the expensive artwork on the walls. They looked at my house exactly the way a butcher looks at a heavy piece of meat. These were the private equity investors Mitchell had warned me about. They were the financial monsters Bradley owed his life to, and they were here to personally inspect their new collateral. I was escorted into the formal dining room and placed at the far end of the long mahogany table. It was the exact seat where I had carved Thanksgiving turkeys for 3 decades, but tonight it felt like sitting in the prisoner box at a trial. Bradley stood at the absolute head of the table, holding up a heavy crystal flute filled with golden, bubbling champagne. He tapped a silver spoon against the glass, commanding the attention of the entire room. He raised his glass high and announced a toast to new beginnings and to making difficult but necessary family choices. He looked directly down the length of the table at me. He told the silent room that it broke his heart to see my mind slipping away so quickly, but that he and Monica were fully committed to providing me with the best possible care in a secure facility starting tomorrow morning. He actually managed to force a single fake tear to the corner of his eye. The country club friends murmured their deep sympathies, praising Bradley for being such a devoted and selfless son. Beneath the heavy mahogany table, my left hand rested quietly on my lap, hidden completely from view by the thick white tablecloth. I reached over with my right index finger and tapped the smooth glass face of my smartwatch. A tiny application launched silently on the dark screen, and a microscopic red dot began to blink slowly, indicating that the microphone was actively recording. I made sure my sleeve was pulled down tight to hide the device. I was not just going to survive this humiliating dinner. I was going to capture every single lie, every boastful claim, and every piece of criminal evidence necessary to send my son to a federal prison. The caterers began to serve the main course, placing heavy porcelain plates of expensive food in front of the guests. The room filled with the sound of clinking silver and loud, cheerful conversation. That was when Monica stood up from her chair, located right next to Bradley. She reached down and picked up something brightly colored from a side table. She walked slowly down the length of the dining room, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The conversation around the table naturally faded as the guests turned to watch her. She stopped directly behind my chair and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. Monica held up a large plastic adult bib decorated with a ridiculous cartoon pattern. She leaned over my shoulder, speaking in a sickeningly sweet voice that was loud enough for every single person in the room to hear clearly. She said, "We just need to put this on you, Wally, in case you have another one of your clumsy little accidents." She said the catering was simply too expensive to ruin with spills, and they could not risk me staining my nice clothes before my big move tomorrow. A hot flash of pure, absolute rage ignited in the center of my chest. It took every single ounce of willpower I possessed not to stand up, tear the plastic out of her hands, and throw her out of my dining room. My jaw locked so tightly my teeth ached. But I remembered the cold, dark words Mitchell had spoken in the diner. I had to let them think they had won. I had to play the broken man. So I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly imitating the posture of a deeply confused and helpless elder. I did not raise my hands to stop her. I simply stared blankly at my empty dinner plate. Monica reached around my neck and tied the plastic strings tight. She patted me firmly on the head like a disobedient dog and walked proudly back to her seat. A few of the guests let out uncomfortable little laughs, while others shook their heads, whispering about how tragic it was to see a man deteriorate so badly. Bradley just grinned, taking another massive gulp of my stolen champagne. He told the table that it was a tragedy indeed, but that they had found a lovely locked ward that specialized in severe dementia, where I would be completely safe from myself. The humiliation tasted metallic and bitter in the back of my throat. I sat there wearing the plastic bib, listening to my own son casually discuss locking me away as if he were talking about putting an old sick horse out to pasture. But the true value of my silent endurance was about to reveal itself. With the dinner in full swing, Bradley leaned across the table to speak directly to the three men in the dark suits. Because he was sitting relatively close to me and his voice was naturally loud, my smartwatch captured every single word perfectly. The lead investor, a man with slicked-back silver hair and cold, dead eyes, asked Bradley if all the legal paperwork for the property transfer was finalized for tomorrow morning. He stated clearly that his firm was not in the business of granting extensions and that the outstanding bridge loan needed to be satisfied immediately. Bradley waved his hand dismissively, projecting absolute arrogance. He told the investor not to worry about a thing. Bradley stated clearly on the recording that he had full medical power of attorney signed by a doctor declaring me legally incompetent. He bragged that he had absolute control over the estate and that the deed transfer would be signed, sealed, and delivered by 10:00 tomorrow morning without any interference from the state. The silver-haired investor nodded slowly, taking a sip of his wine. He asked Bradley if the old man was going to be a problem during the signing. Bradley let out a cruel, sharp laugh that echoed perfectly into the microphone on my wrist. Bradley told the men that I would be heavily medicated and strapped into the passenger seat of his car before the notary even arrived. He said the property was completely free and clear, and the funds would hit their offshore accounts by noon. It was a perfect, uninterrupted confession of premeditated elder abuse and federal wire fraud delivered straight to a recording device. The dinner dragged on for another agonizing hour. They ate the expensive food and drank bottle after bottle of the vintage wine Cynthia and I had collected over the decades. I sat in absolute silence wearing the degrading plastic bib, staring at the table. Every time Bradley made a cruel joke at my expense, every time Monica rolled her eyes and called me a burden, the tiny red light on my wrist blinked silently, capturing their malice. My physical body was trapped in a room full of arrogant predators, but my mind was completely free and entirely focused on the morning. When the dessert was finally cleared away, Bradley stood up and announced that he needed to get his beauty sleep for the big day tomorrow. He told the caterers to leave the mess in the kitchen for the morning staff to handle. The guests slowly began to file out of the dining room, saying their fake goodbyes and wishing Bradley the best of luck with his stressful family transition. The private equity investors left without saying a word to me, simply nodding at Bradley to confirm their appointment for the next day. Once the front door finally closed, Bradley and Monica did not even bother to help me take off the bib. They simply turned off the main dining room lights, plunging me into darkness, and walked upstairs to their bedroom, laughing about how perfectly the evening had gone. I sat alone in the dark for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached down and carefully untied the plastic bib from my neck, letting it fall to the floor. I tapped my smartwatch, ending the recording and saving the audio file deep into the encrypted memory. The humiliation had been excruciating, a deep burning cut to my pride and my dignity. But the pain was entirely temporary. The trap was now fully loaded, and my son had just willingly placed his head right inside the jaws. I stood up from the mahogany table, leaving the dirty plates and the empty crystal glasses behind. I walked slowly upstairs to my bedroom, feeling a profound, dark sense of peace. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow the facade would drop, and the execution would begin. The extravagant dinner was stretching into its second agonizing hour. The private equity investors had finished their roasted lamb and were leaning back in their chairs, drinking my vintage wine. Bradley was completely intoxicated, by his own perceived brilliance. He was holding court at the head of the table, laughing loudly and telling completely fabricated stories about his successful business ventures. I sat frozen in my chair at the opposite end of the mahogany table. My plastic bib was still tied tight around my neck. The guests ignored me entirely, treating me like a broken piece of furniture that was scheduled to be thrown out in the morning. Then Bradley suddenly clapped his hands together with a loud, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling. He announced to the dark-suited men that he had procured a box of extremely rare imported cigars to properly celebrate their lucrative real estate transaction. He reached into the pocket of his tailored suit trousers and pulled out a heavy brass key. It was the key to Cynthia private office. He told the men he kept the expensive humidor locked away in the back room to keep the temperature perfectly controlled. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. Bradley turned his back to the dining room and began walking down the long hardwood hallway toward the locked office. My mind raced backward in time, reconstructing every single frantic movement I had made earlier that afternoon. I remembered pulling the heavy broken slab of drywall back into place over the dark steel vault. I remembered dragging the massive wooden bookshelf across the carpet to hide the jagged cracks in the wall. But then a terrifying image flashed in my mind with blinding clarity. I had been rushing. I had been terrified that someone would walk through the front door. I had completely forgotten to vacuum the floor. There was a thick, visible layer of pure white plaster dust scattered all over the dark mahogany baseboards and the dark blue woven carpet. It looked like a fresh layer of winter snow right in the middle of the room. If Bradley unlocked that door and flipped the bright overhead fluorescent lights, he would see the white dust immediately. He would walk over to the bookshelf and look behind it. He would see the broken drywall and the massive steel safe. The entire Shadow Trust operation would be exposed before the trap could close. He would realize I knew everything. He would absolutely destroy the silver thumb drive and burn the physical deeds before Friday morning ever arrived. The trap would completely fail, and I would be left with absolutely nothing. I listened to the heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes walking further down the hallway. He was getting closer to the office door. I had maybe 10 seconds before he inserted the brass key into the lock. I needed a distraction. I needed something so incredibly loud and so violently chaotic that it would force him to turn around and run back to the dining room immediately. I frantically scanned the area around my chair. My eyes darted across the elegant dining room looking for a weapon of mass distraction. Just to my right, a young catering waiter had set up a temporary serving station on a delicate antique wooden folding table. Resting directly on top of the fragile table was a massive, heavy silver tray. The tray was completely loaded with 3 dozen delicate crystal dessert glasses stacked in a tall, glittering pyramid. Next to the glasses sat a large porcelain bowl filled with a dark, sticky chocolate dessert sauce. It was a towering monument of expensive, fragile glass, balancing precariously on thin wooden legs. It was the perfect target. But to execute this plan, I had to willingly subject myself to a level of public humiliation that would completely strip away whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left. I had to become the absolute worst version of the pathetic burden they claimed I was. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of roasted meat and expensive perfume. I waited until I heard the faint metallic jingle of the brass key sliding into the lock down the hall. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor beneath my chair. I threw my entire upper body weight violently to the right side. I let my shoulder crash heavily into the edge of the antique wooden folding table. The impact sent a painful shockwave up my collarbone, but I pushed even harder, digging my leather shoes into the floor for maximum leverage. The wooden table groaned loudly and buckled under my weight. The massive silver tray tilted sharply upward. For a single agonizing second time seemed to slow down completely. I watched the tall pyramid of delicate crystal glasses shift and slide. Then gravity took over with absolute ruthless force. The entire tray slid off the table and crashed down onto the hardwood floor. The sound was absolutely deafening. It was an explosive, shattering crash that sounded like a bomb detonating inside the dining room. Thousands of razor-sharp shards of expensive crystal exploded outward in every direction, reflecting the warm light of the chandelier. The heavy porcelain bowl shattered violently, sending thick, dark chocolate sauce splattering across the pristine white walls and ruining the expensive silk dresses of the wealthy guests sitting nearby. The dining room erupted into total, pure chaos. Women shrieked in absolute terror, jumping up from their chairs and frantically brushing glass shards from their laps. Men shouted in shock, knocking over their own chairs as they scrambled away from the sticky, expanding puddle of chocolate and shattered crystal. Monica let out a piercing, completely hysterical scream. She stood frozen, staring in absolute horror at her ruined designer shoes. The deafening noise echoed down the hallway, completely masking any sound from the back rooms. A few seconds later, I heard exactly what I needed to hear: the frantic, heavy footsteps of my son sprinting back toward the dining room. Bradley burst through the doorway, his face flushed, a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He had completely abandoned his mission to fetch the cigars. He stared at the absolute devastation in his perfect dining room. He looked at the screaming guests, the ruined walls, and the thousands of pieces of broken glass. Then he looked directly at me. I was lying awkwardly on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage, acting as though I had simply lost my balance and tumbled out of my chair. I pulled my knees to my chest and began to rock back and forth perfectly, faking a state of deep, terrified confusion. I let my hands shake violently, and I kept my eyes wide and vacant. Bradley marched across the room, crushing broken glass under his leather shoes. He stood directly over me, vibrating with pure, absolute rage. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not offer his hand to help me up off the floor. Instead, he looked at his wealthy friends and the private equity investors who were staring at me with obvious disgust. Bradley pointed his finger right at my face and yelled that this was exactly why I belonged in a locked, padded room. He screamed that I was a complete disaster and a danger to everyone around me. He ordered the terrified catering staff to clean up the pathetic mess immediately. He grabbed me roughly by the arm and hauled me up to my feet, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional victory hidden deep inside my chest was incredibly sweet. The private equity investors muttered their impatient goodbyes, completely disgusted by the chaotic family drama. They walked out the front door, promising to return first thing Friday morning for the final property signing. Bradley dragged me forcefully up the stairs to my bedroom, cursing me with every single step. He shoved me into my room and slammed the door, violently locking it from the outside. I stood alone in the dark bedroom, listening to his heavy footsteps fade down the hallway. My shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, and my clothes were covered in dust and sticky sugar. The humiliation was absolutely total, but I smiled in the darkness. The secret vault remained completely hidden. The timeline was entirely secure. My absolute nightmare was finally coming to an end. Friday morning dawned completely gray and overcast, mirroring the heavy, suffocating tension that had settled inside the walls of my home. I woke up long before the sun rose, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absolute silence of my bedroom. Today was the day. Today, the brilliant legal trap my wife had engineered from her deathbed would finally snap shut. I forced myself out of bed and dressed in my most worn-out pair of faded corduroy trousers and a baggy knitted sweater that hung loosely from my shoulders. I needed to look exactly like the broken, defeated old man they entirely expected to see. I packed a small canvas duffel bag with a few pairs of cheap socks and some old flannel shirts just to complete the pathetic illusion that I was genuinely preparing to be hauled away to a locked medical facility. I walked slowly down the stairs, clutching the wooden banister with both hands, taking slow, deliberate, agonizing steps. The house was already buzzing with frantic, arrogant energy. Monica was in the kitchen, loudly instructing the morning catering staff to prepare fresh carafes of imported coffee and bake expensive French pastries for their incoming guests. She was wearing a sharp white tailored suit, looking far more like a ruthless corporate executive than a loving, supportive family member. Bradley was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor of the foyer, talking rapidly on his cell phone. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit with a silk tie, his hair slicked back with expensive styling gel. He looked up and saw me standing at the bottom of the stairs, clutching my pathetic little canvas bag. A cruel, satisfied smirk spread across his face. He ended his phone call and walked over to me, grabbing the bag from my hands and tossing it carelessly into the dark corner of the hallway. He told me to just go sit in my leather armchair by the window and stay completely out of the way until the medical transport van arrived to collect me. I nodded slowly, shuffling my feet against the floorboards, and made my way into the living room. The large, heavy oak coffee table had been completely cleared of Cynthia Beautiful art books and her decorative glass coasters. In their place sat thick stacks of crisp white legal documents neatly arranged in perfect rectangular piles. A sleek black leather portfolio rested exactly in the center of the table next to a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The stage was perfectly set for my execution. At exactly 9 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. Monica practically sprinted to the door, pulling it open with a massive fake smile. A young woman in a gray skirt suit walked in carrying a heavy black briefcase and a large brass stamp. She was the official state notary public hired by Bradley to legally witness and verify the final destruction of my life. She looked incredibly bored, completely indifferent to the tragic family dynamic unfolding right in front of her. She barely even glanced at me sitting in the corner before she began organizing her official seals and ink pads on the coffee table. 10 minutes later, the heavy thud of expensive car doors closing echoed from the circular driveway. The 3 private equity investors from the disastrous dinner party walked through the front door. They wore the same dark, immaculate suits and carried the exact same cold, predatory energy. The lead investor, the man with the slicked-back silver hair, did not even bother to say good morning to Monica. He walked directly into the living room, looked at his expensive luxury wristwatch, and demanded that they get this transaction over with immediately, because he had a private flight to catch at noon. Bradley was practically vibrating with nervous excitement and deep unearned greed. He ushered the 3 men to the plush leather sofas surrounding the coffee table. He poured them cups of hot black coffee, acting like a triumphant king welcoming his royal court into his grand castle. I sat silently in my worn armchair, just a few feet away, watching the executioners sharpen their legal blades. The silver-haired investor picked up the first stack of thick documents. He looked coldly at Bradley and asked to see the medical power of attorney before he signed over the massive corporate wire transfer. Bradley confidently reached into his black leather portfolio and pulled out a thick document bound with a heavy blue paper cover. He slapped it down onto the coffee table right in front of the investor. Bradley stated proudly that it was a fully executed and physician-certified declaration of total medical incompetence. He said his poor father was suffering from severe advanced dementia and completely lacked the mental capacity to make any legal or financial decisions on his own behalf. The notary public picked up the forged document, scanning the pages with bored, tired eyes. She looked at the fake signature of the corrupt private practice doctor and then stamped her heavy brass seal onto the bottom of the page, verifying the absolute lie as a binding legal truth. The lead investor nodded slowly, a cold, greedy smile creeping onto his face. He pulled a sleek silver tablet from his briefcase and tapped the glowing screen, opening his offshore banking application. He told Bradley that the wire transfer for the wholesale purchase of the house was fully loaded and ready to execute the exact second the final property deed was officially signed and notarized. The air in the room grew incredibly thick and heavy. The final moment was rapidly approaching. This was the exact edge of the cliff Mitchell had warned me about during our late-night meeting at the diner. Bradley was voluntarily handing over forged federal documents in front of multiple witnesses and state officials to secure a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. He was permanently cementing his own criminal record with every single breath he took. Bradley picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen and quickly signed his name across 4 different pages of the primary property transfer deed. He pushed the documents across the dark wood table to the silver-haired investor, who smoothly added his own aggressive signature. The notary stamped each page with a loud, heavy thud, validating the illegal sale of my beautiful family home. Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh of absolute relief. He leaned back against the plush sofa, looking around the living room like a man who had just conquered an entire country. He looked at Monica and winked a silent, arrogant celebration of their stolen wealth. But then the lead investor held up a single thin sheet of paper, stopping the celebration dead in its tracks. He told Bradley that their corporate legal department required one final signature to completely indemnify the private equity firm from any future family disputes or civil lawsuits. The investor looked directly at me, sitting quietly in the shadows of the corner. He said they needed the old man to physically sign his own voluntary committal papers acknowledging his immediate transfer to the state medical facility. Bradley rolled his eyes, acting deeply annoyed by this sudden bureaucratic hurdle. He stood up from the sofa, holding the committal paper and the gold-plated pen. He walked over to my armchair, towering over me with absolute physical dominance, blocking the morning light from the window. He shoved the crisp paper onto my lap and pressed the heavy metal pen into my right hand. He spoke to me in that sickeningly sweet, condescending voice he had perfected over the past few months. He told me it was just a simple, harmless formality. He said I just needed to put my name on the dotted line so the nice men in the white van could finally take me to my relaxing new home. I looked down at the white paper resting on my faded corduroy trousers. It was a binding legal authorization to lock me in a psychiatric ward against my will for the rest of my natural life. My fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal of the fountain pen. I intentionally initiated a violent physical tremor in my hand, making the pen shake uncontrollably against the thick paper. I looked up at the 3 private equity investors sitting on my sofa. The silver-haired man let out a harsh, cruel scoff, leaning over to his partner and whispering that it was absolutely pathetic watching a grown man lose his mind so completely. They sneered at me openly, their faces twisted with deep elitist disgust. They genuinely thought I was a broken, worthless animal entirely at their mercy. Bradley placed his heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing my collarbone painfully through my thick sweater. He leaned down and hissed directly into my ear, dropping the sweet act entirely. He ordered me to stop shaking immediately and just sign the damn paper before I ruined everything he had worked so hard to build. I held the pen hovering the gold nib just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. The tension in the room was absolute and completely suffocating. Everyone was staring at my trembling hand, waiting for me to sign away my freedom and finalize their massive financial heist. I took a slow, deep breath, locking the muscles in my arm and stopping the fake tremor entirely. I was not going to sign anything. The timeline was complete, and the trap was fully loaded. Bradley had submitted the forged documents to the bank application and signed the fraudulent property deeds in front of a state witness. His federal crimes were now a matter of permanent legal record. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper, preparing to drop the facade entirely, and look my son right in his cold, dead eyes to tell him he owned absolutely nothing. But before the ink could even bleed into the page, a loud, sharp sound shattered the suffocating silence of the living room. The heavy brass doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession. It was instantly followed by the incredibly aggressive, deafening sound of heavy fists pounding violently against the thick wood of the front door. The heavy pounding on the front door shattered the suffocating tension in the living room. Bradley froze with his hand still resting heavily on my shoulder. He looked toward the foyer, his face twisting with deep, severe irritation. He barked at Monica to go see who was interrupting his massive financial victory. Monica hurried to the front door, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floors. She pulled the heavy oak door open, ready to yell at whoever was standing on the porch. But she did not yell. Instead, she took 3 rapid steps backward, stumbling slightly and gasping for air. Walking through the doorway with the absolute dark confidence of a highly paid executioner was Mitchell Reed. He was wearing an immaculate dark navy suit, his leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. But Mitchell was not alone. Flanking him on either side were 2 large uniformed police officers, their heavy duty belts creaking loudly as they stepped into my foyer. Right behind them was a tall, severe-looking woman, wearing a gray trench coat and holding a thick stack of state banking files. Bradley stared at the group walking into his living room, his arrogant smile melting into a mask of pure, total confusion. He demanded to know what the hell was going on and who these people were. He yelled that this was a private residence and they were illegally interrupting a highly sensitive corporate real estate transaction. Mitchell did not even look at Bradley. His cold, dark eyes swept across the room, ignoring the shouting, and locked directly onto me. Mitchell walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug, completely ignoring the 3 private equity investors who were now standing up from the leather sofas in alarm. He walked right up to my armchair, towering over Bradley, who instinctively took a physical step back from the massive corporate lawyer. Mitchell looked down at my trembling hand, holding the heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He gave me a single, incredibly subtle nod. It was the signal. The terrible waiting was officially over. Mitchell reached down and gently took the pen from my shaking fingers. He clicked the gold cap shut and slipped it casually into his own jacket pocket. He looked at me and said, "You are not going to be needing this today, Wallace." The very moment he spoke my name, the pathetic, confused facade I had maintained for months completely evaporated. I stopped my hands from shaking. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor, and I stood up from the armchair. I did not struggle and I did not hunch my shoulders. I stood completely straight, pulling myself up to my full, absolute height. I rolled my shoulders back and looked my son directly in the eye. The look of absolute pure horror that washed over Bradley's face was something I will remember for the rest of my natural life. He stared at me, realizing in a single terrifying second that I was not a broken dementia patient. I was completely lucid, entirely sharp, and deeply dangerous. Mitchell turned his attention to the sleek black coffee table. He unlatched his leather briefcase with a loud, sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out the thick manila folder I had given him at the diner in the middle of the night. He slammed it down onto the exact center of the table, right on top of the fraudulent property deeds Bradley and the investors had just signed. Mitchell looked at the silver-haired investor and introduced himself as the senior litigation partner representing the true legal owner of this estate. He pointed to the thick folder and announced that the document they had just signed was entirely worthless paper. He explained that this property and every single liquid asset associated with the Montgomery name had been legally transferred into an irrevocable corporate entity called the Phoenix Holdings Trust nearly a full year ago. Mitchell stated with absolute cold authority that my late wife Cynthia had built the trust from her hospital bed and that I, Wallace Montgomery, was the sole controlling director of the entire corporation. He looked at the wealthy private equity men and told them that Bradley did not own the walls of this house, the roof over their heads, or even the expensive rug they were standing on. He told them they had just attempted to purchase stolen property from a desperate fraudster, and if they did not step away from the table immediately, he would personally name their offshore firm as co-conspirators in a massive federal racketeering lawsuit. The 3 investors looked down at the documents, then looked up at Bradley with eyes full of pure, violent hatred. They realized instantly they had been completely played by a desperate idiot who had no actual assets to sell. Bradley started to panic, his breathing growing loud and ragged in the quiet room. He scrambled to pick up the blue-bound medical document from the table. He waved it frantically in the air, screaming that Mitchell was a liar and a fake. Bradley yelled that he had a physician-certified power of attorney proving I was legally incompetent and that he was the rightful legal executor of the entire estate. Mitchell let out a low, dark chuckle that chilled the entire room. He looked at Bradley and said the state medical board arrested your corrupt college buddy yesterday afternoon. Mitchell explained that the private investigator Cynthia hired had submitted all the digital evidence of their conspiracy directly to the state medical licensing board months ago. The fake doctor had completely flipped the moment he was placed in handcuffs by the authorities. He confessed everything to save himself. He admitted to signing the fraudulent medical affidavits for a 20% cut of the final real estate sale. Mitchell then looked down at the terrified notary public, who was frantically packing her brass stamps back into her black bag. He told her she had just legally witnessed and verified a forged federal document, and she would be hearing from the state licensing board before the end of the week. Bradley dropped the blue medical document onto the floor like it was physically burning his hands. He looked over at Monica, begging her to say something to defend him, but his wife was backing away toward the kitchen, her face pale white, realizing the entire ship was rapidly sinking and she was tied to the anchor. But Mitchell was not finished delivering the final execution. He turned to the tall, severe woman in the gray trench coat, who had remained completely silent near the doorway. Mitchell introduced her to the room as a senior investigator for the State Financial Crimes Division. The woman stepped forward, her cold eyes locked directly on my son. She held up her thick stack of official banking files. She asked Bradley if he had authorized an electronic transfer of funds from the primary estate checking account to his private lenders early this morning to try and clear his initial debts. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly in the dead silence of the living room. He nodded weakly, entirely unable to form a single spoken word. The state investigator looked at him with absolute professional disgust. She explained the brilliant lethal trap my wife had embedded deep in the banking code. She told Bradley that the specific accounts he had accessed were legally classified as frozen bait accounts under the Phoenix Holdings corporate structure. By using a forged medical document to access those specific funds and attempting to wire them across state lines to a private equity firm, Bradley had automatically triggered a Level 1 federal banking alarm. She told him he did not just commit simple family theft today. He had committed aggravated federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse. The true massive weight of his actions finally crashed down onto Bradley's shoulders, crushing him completely. His knees visibly buckled, and he slumped down onto the arm of the leather sofa. He had thought he was so incredibly smart, outmaneuvering a dying woman and a helpless old man. But Cynthia had seen his terrible greed coming from a mile away, and she had used it to build his perfect prison. She knew he would be far too arrogant to check the corporate registry. She knew he would try to steal the money the exact second he thought he had the legal cover. Every single step he took over the past 6 months, moving into my house, destroying my wife's office, treating me like a sick animal, was just him walking blindly deeper and deeper into the iron trap she had set. Mitchell looked at Bradley and delivered the final devastating blow. He said the money you thought you transferred this morning was officially intercepted by the federal government at exactly 8 o'clock. Your personal accounts are permanently frozen by the state. You have absolutely no money, you have no house, and you have zero legal leverage left. I stood perfectly still, watching the boy I had raised completely dissolve into a terrified criminal. The quiet dignity of my wife filled the room surrounding me like an invisible shield. Mitchell looked over at the 2 uniformed police officers who had been standing quietly by the front door, waiting for their explicit cue. He nodded to them calmly and said, "I believe you gentlemen have a federal warrant to execute today." The silver-haired investor did not wait for the police officers to cross the room. He stepped directly into Bradley's personal space, his face twisted into a mask of absolute corporate rage. He did not yell, but his voice was a low, dangerous growl that carried more threat than any scream ever could. He told Bradley that he had just tried to defraud a billion-dollar private equity firm using fake medical papers and stolen deeds, He said his legal department was going to strip Bradley of every single thing he owned down to the very shoes on his feet. The investor promised that even if Bradley somehow survived the federal prison sentence he was about to receive, he would spend the rest of his miserable life working minimum wage jobs just to pay off the civil damages. He promised to make Bradley a permanent ghost in the financial world. The three men in the dark suits turned around in perfect unison and marched out the front door, leaving the fraudulent contracts sitting on the coffee table as worthless garbage. Bradley watched his only lifeline walk out the door. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The two large uniformed police officers took another step forward, the heavy leather of their utility belts creaking in the quiet room. The state investigator stood with her arms crossed, her cold eyes tracking his every single terrified movement. Bradley was completely out of options. His grand master plan had evaporated in a matter of minutes. He looked desperately around the room, his eyes darting frantically, like a trapped rat looking for a crack in the wall. Finally, his gaze landed on his wife. Monica was standing near the archway leading to the kitchen, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist. Bradley reached his hands out toward her, his voice cracking with sheer, pathetic desperation. He begged her to step forward and tell the officers that this was all a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with her to tell them that the private doctor had lied to both of them and that they genuinely thought they were doing the right thing for my failing health. He was desperately begging his partner in crime to throw him a life preserver, to offer even a tiny shred of plausible deniability that might keep him out of federal handcuffs. He looked at her with tears welling in his eyes, waiting for the fierce, supportive woman who had mocked me and planned their luxurious future just the night before. But Monica did not step forward to defend her husband. She looked at the police officers, then at the state investigator, and finally at Mitchell Reed. Her eyes performed rapid, complex calculations, processing the absolute reality of the situation. There was no money. There was no inherited mansion. There was no luxury future. There was only a sinking ship heavily weighted with federal felony charges. In a fraction of a second, the sheer force of her own greedy self-preservation kicked in. Monica let out a sudden loud sob, throwing her hands up over her mouth. She took 3 rapid steps backward, physically distancing herself from Bradley, as if he were covered in a deadly, contagious disease. She looked at the state investigator and began to cry, producing large, wet tears on absolute command. She cried out that she had absolutely no idea what Bradley was doing behind closed doors. She claimed with a shaking voice that Bradley completely controlled all of their personal finances and that she was just a naive, supportive wife. She looked right at me and sobbed, telling the room that she loved Cynthia deeply, and she would never, ever do anything to hurt her beloved father-in-law. She said Bradley told her my dementia was real, and that she was just following his instructions because she trusted him. She completely and utterly threw him right under the bus without a single second of hesitation. Bradley stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her betrayal. His mouth hung open and his eyes were wide with total disbelief. He screamed at her, calling her a lying snake. He yelled that she was the one who picked out the miserable locked ward at the assisted living facility. He screamed that she was the one who bought the humiliating plastic bib just last night to mock me in front of their wealthy friends. He begged the officers not to believe her tears, swearing that she was in on the entire plan from the very beginning. But his desperate screaming only made him look more unhinged and more guilty. The state investigator simply wrote something down on her notepad, completely unimpressed by the chaotic family drama. The taller of the 2 police officers stepped directly behind Bradley. He grabbed the sleeve of Bradley's expensive tailored suit and twisted his arm forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly through the living room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The officer read Bradley his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, completely drowning out his pathetic sobbing. The officer formally stated that he was being placed under immediate arrest for felony forgery, criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and federal wire fraud. With each charge spoken aloud, Bradley's knees buckled further toward the floor until the officers had to physically hold him upright by his armpits. He looked over his shoulder at me as the officers began to drag him toward the front door. His face was stained with tears and completely distorted by pure terror. He cried out, begging me to make them stop. He sobbed, asking me to remember that he was my only boy, the son I had raised and loved. He pleaded with me to show him just a little bit of mercy. I looked at the man struggling in the steel handcuffs and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, and certainly no mercy. I stood tall and spoke in a clear, calm voice. I told him that my real son died the very day he decided his father's life was nothing more than a disposable financial asset. I told him he was nothing to me now but a common thief who finally got caught. The officers did not give him a chance to respond. They pulled him roughly through the front door and marched him down the brick path toward the waiting patrol car. The heavy wooden front door swung shut, leaving a profound ringing silence in the living room. The suffocating, toxic energy that had plagued my home for the past 6 months was suddenly gone completely, sucked out the door along with my treacherous son. The state investigator nodded to Mitchell, thanking him for the perfectly organized files, before she quietly let herself out to follow the police to the station. Only Mitchell, Monica, and I remained in the house. Monica stood near the kitchen archway, wiping away her fake tears. She let out a long, trembling sigh of pure relief, thinking her brilliant acting performance had successfully saved her from the wreckage. She looked over at me and attempted a weak, shaky smile. She took a step forward, speaking in a soft, gentle voice. She told me she was so incredibly sorry for the nightmare Bradley had put us through. She said she was so glad I was safe and that we could finally start to heal from this terrible ordeal together as a family. She actually thought I was going to let her stay in the house. She thought she could just pivot back to being the caring daughter-in-law and continue living rent-free under my roof. Mitchell Reed let out a sharp, completely humorless laugh. He reached into his dark leather briefcase one final time and pulled out a single, crisp white sheet of paper. He walked over to Monica and shoved the paper directly against her chest, forcing her to take it. He told her she was currently standing on private corporate property owned entirely by the Phoenix Holdings Trust. He explained that she had absolutely no legal tenancy rights, no lease agreement, and no familial protections. The paper in her trembling hand was an immediate emergency eviction notice signed and authorized by a state judge at 8 o'clock this morning. Monica stared at the eviction notice, her fake smile completely vanishing. She stammered, asking what she was supposed to do and where she was supposed to go. She reminded Mitchell that Bradley had drained their joint accounts, and she did not even have enough cash to book a cheap hotel room. Mitchell looked down at his expensive luxury wristwatch, his face completely devoid of any human sympathy. He told her that her personal financial problems were absolutely none of his concern. He stated in a cold, flat voice that she had exactly 10 minutes to walk upstairs, find one single average-sized suitcase and pack whatever clothing she could fit inside it. He warned her that if she attempted to take any jewelry, any electronics, or any items that belonged to my late wife, she would be immediately arrested for grand larceny. He looked her dead in the eye and told her that if she was still standing inside this house when his watch hit the 10-minute mark, he would call the police officers back inside and have her physically dragged out by her designer hair for criminal trespassing. Monica looked at me one last time, her eyes wide with genuine panic, hoping I would intervene and show her the mercy she had never once shown me. I simply turned my back to her and walked over to the window to watch the police car backing out of my driveway. Behind me, I heard the frantic, terrified sound of her high heels sprinting up the oak staircase. She knew Mitchell was not bluffing. The grand illusion of her wealthy, perfect life had completely shattered, leaving her with absolutely nothing but 10 minutes and a single empty suitcase. The collapse of their terrible empire was finally absolute and complete. 6 months have passed since the morning the federal authorities dragged my son out of my living room. The heavy, suffocating winter has finally given way to a bright, warm spring. I am sitting in the exact same leather chair behind the large mahogany drafting table in my late wife's beautiful office. The room looks exactly the way Cynthia left it. The massive, jagged hole in the drywall has been perfectly repaired and painted over by professional contractors. The imposing steel security vault remains hidden safely inside the structure of the house holding the physical documents that saved my life. But the atmosphere inside this room and inside my own mind is completely different. I am no longer a grieving, terrified old man hiding from his own flesh and blood. I have not just survived the vicious attack on my life. I have completely thrived. I look down at the thick stack of professional letters resting on the desk in front of me. They are not bills, and they are certainly not threats from private equity investors. They are heartfelt letters of profound gratitude from families all across the state. Using the massive financial resources Cynthia protected inside the Shadow Corporation, I established a powerful non-profit organization. I named it the Cynthia Montgomery Foundation for Elder Justice. I partnered directly with Mitchell Reed and his aggressive corporate law firm. We do not just offer gentle advice to older people who are being financially abused by their greedy relatives. We provide them with the absolute best corporate litigators in the country, completely free of charge. We hunt down the financial predators who try to steal from the vulnerable, and we dismantle their lives with the exact same ruthless legal precision that Cynthia used to save mine. Every time I read a letter from a grandmother who got her stolen house back, or a grandfather who saw his abusive children face real legal consequences, I feel Cynthia sitting right next to me. This foundation is her ultimate legacy. She did not just build a fortress to protect her husband. She built a weapon to protect thousands of others. I take a sip of my hot black coffee and look out the large bay window at the blooming garden. I do not spend my days worrying about Bradley anymore. He is currently sitting in a federal detention center, awaiting trial for multiple severe felonies. The government seized his failing business and his luxury cars to pay off the massive fines. Monica is working a grueling minimum-wage retail job, living in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the bad side of town. They tried to throw me away like a piece of broken trash, and instead, they permanently ruined their own lives. I feel no pity for them. They earned every single second of their misery. The quiet peace of the morning is gently interrupted by the sound of the front doorbell ringing. I stand up from the desk, smoothing out the front of my crisp, clean button-down shirt. I walk down the long hallway without a single trace of a fake tremor or a hesitant shuffle. I open the heavy oak front door to find Pete Reynolds standing on the porch. He is wearing his familiar denim overalls and holding his canvas tool bag. He takes off his work cap and gives me a warm, genuine smile. He is not here to break open a wall or uncover a terrifying family secret today. He is just here to fix a simple dripping faucet in the kitchen sink. I invite Pete inside and lead him back to the kitchen. He walks through the foyer and the living room looking around with wide, appreciative eyes. He tells me the house feels incredibly different. He says the air feels lighter, and the whole place just feels incredibly warm and welcoming again. I know exactly what he means. The toxic, suffocating presence of greed and arrogance has been completely scrubbed from the floorboards. I stand near the granite island, watching Pete efficiently tighten the pipes under the sink. When he is finished, I hand him his payment along with a generous tip. I ask him if he has time to sit down and share a fresh pot of coffee before he heads to his next job. Pete smiles widely and pulls up a wooden stool right next to me. We sit together in the bright morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, drinking our coffee and talking about baseball and the changing spring weather. It is a completely normal, mundane conversation, and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. I look around my clean, quiet kitchen, feeling a profound sense of deep, absolute peace. The brutal war is over. So, This beautiful house is no longer a hostile battleground where I have to fight for my basic right to exist. It stands tall and proud as a permanent monument to a brilliant wife who possessed the incredible foresight to see the approaching storm and a patient husband who found the ruthless strength to let the trap snap shut. I learned the hardest lesson a father could ever learn. True family is not simply determined by shared biology or the name written on a birth certificate. True family is defined by genuine respect, absolute loyalty, and a love that never treats another human being as a disposable resource. Cynthia gave me the ultimate gift, and I intend to spend the rest of my days honoring her brilliant mind and enjoying the beautiful, peaceful life she fought so incredibly hard to secure for me. Did you like my story? Let me know which city you are listening from down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and survival, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you more stories just like this one. Thank you so much for your sweet support, and I look forward to reading your thoughts. See you in the next life story.